The Easter Rising, part 2, the lead up to the Easter Rising. I had intended to do this a lot sooner. So tomorrow is Easter Sunday, but if you know much about the Rising, you know that it didn't actually happen on Easter Sunday, it actually happened on Easter Monday, and there's a reason for that. Also, Easter was at the end of April. It was April 23rd, I think, was Easter Sunday, and April 24th, when the Rising happened, was Monday morning. So, I don't feel too bad about being a little late with the second part of this. So this is the lead up to the Easter Rising. In the last little video, I talked about setting the stage with the characters. There was the Irish Volunteers, who were formed as a counter to the Ulster Volunteers. And I said that their baseline politics was independence for Ireland. And I think that's even overstating a little bit. The Ulster Volunteers were formed to oppose what's called Home Rule. So there was a movement in Ireland that was successful, which put a part of Parliament in Dublin to manage Irish affairs. But ultimately, they were still under the authority of the British government. And so the Ulster Volunteers were worried that that would lead to Irish independence, and they were loyal to the United Kingdom. And so they formed the Ulster Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were in response to that. So really, maybe a big portion of the Irish Volunteers were not even so much about independence for Ireland as they were in support of Home Rule. And what maybe even more true is that I don't think that they were all revolutionaries necessarily. They were not looking to take arms against Britain for Irish independence in total. There were certainly a lot of them that were, and don't want to negate that. But I also said that the Irish Volunteers had as many as 200,000 members at one point. It seems like a lot to me, but by the time the Easter Rising happened, there was only 15,000. Why? Well, for the same reason that it was a good time to strike against England because of World War I. Also, there was a huge split among the Irish Volunteers because of World War I, where some of them felt like they needed to join forces and fight with the allies of England and England on that side of the war, and felt like there was kind of two thoughts that were going into that. One of them was that if they went and performed well, maybe England would reward them with more independence for Ireland, which, yeah, okay. And then the other school of thought was that if they didn't, well, after a great war like World War I, they would come back a better trained military operation in order to fight for independence for Ireland. So most of the volunteers enlisted in some way with the British Royal Army. And about 15,000 did not. They said, we're going to stay, and if the war comes to Ireland, we'll defend Ireland. And we're also going to be sure that Home Rule, which was put on hold during World War I, is brought back into play, and continue to fight for it. And then within the Irish Volunteers, so that was the first group, within the Irish Volunteers, I said they're not really within, it's a separate group. But alongside the Irish Volunteers was the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood was a revolutionary organization. They did believe in full independence of Ireland from Great Britain. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but they saw the Volunteers as a potential army for their cause. They thought they were lined well enough for that. So World War I, the split happens, only 15,000 volunteers left. 50,000 is still a big army. The Irish Republican Brotherhood thinks it's enough. And so they are using the Irish Volunteers, they're convincing them to parade and maneuver and do all these symbolic sort of protest gestures. And they're doing it. And the leader of the Irish Volunteers is Owen McNeill. And he is, I'm not 100% sure what his politics are. I like to believe that he at least believed in eventual independence for Ireland, but that's about as far as he went, as far as I can tell. So, but he was pretty gun shy about it. He was one of those people, and I think we all know these people who shied away from action because it wasn't strategic enough, or he didn't, think that there was a possibility that they could win. He wanted a sure thing before any action happened, is what I get from reading about him. So he's a leader of the rising. He's a person that's very important to the rising. He's definitely not a leader of the rising. That I didn't talk about yet. Owen McNeill, and he's the head of the Irish Volunteers at this time. So why didn't the rising happen on Sunday? Well, a series of unfortunate events that made the rising what it was instead of what they hoped it would be happened. And then I should mention, and then there's our people. There's the ICA, the Irish Citizens Army, led now by James Connolly, and they the whole time are out advocating for full independence from England right now. Take up arms, people. It's time. Strike the blow. And their eventual politics were for Socialist Republic of Ireland and international socialism. And so they would often criticize the Irish nationalists, saying that you could free the island, but you can't free its people until you eliminate capitalism. And they would say that we're not fighting for the island of Ireland, we're fighting for the people of Ireland. And when World War I broke out, they hoisted a banner in front of Liberty Hall, which was their headquarters, that said, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland." So their position was quite clear during World War I. So Irish Volunteers, Irish Brotherhood, Irish Republican Brotherhood, and Irish Citizens Army. So the Irish Citizens Army under James Connolly, they began to grow very sick and tired and weary of the Irish Republican Brotherhoods. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, if you don't remember, was clandestine. They didn't operate out in the open. So you didn't know who was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they had a lot of people in the Volunteers organizing and agitating within the Volunteers for full-scale combat for independence. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood had a military council of 6 people. I'm guessing that James Connolly knew about this at the time, but I don't really know. They definitely knew of each other, but they didn't work together yet. But they definitely knew that they both had this initial aim of independence from Great Britain, government-wise, and so the Irish Citizens Army and James Connolly, they finally got fed up. They said, you know what? All of these parades, all of these symbolic actions, all of this stuff, not enough. It's time to strike. We're gonna go. The Irish Citizens Army had 250 people in it. They said, we're doing it. We're going to strike a blow against England. They made it known to, not openly, they didn't put it on posters and stuff, but they made it known to actors within the independence movement, the Fenian movement, that they were going. They were ready to go. And so one night, walking home from Liberty Hall, James Connolly gets picked up by 2 armed men, and they take him to a secret location, and there is the military council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And, he doesn't, the records should say that he doesn't show them a whole lot of respect for this action that they took. And he basically said, well, when are you going to start fighting for the living Fenians instead of parading around celebrating the dead ones? And they finally convinced him, we are ready. We have plans in motion. Please do not go out on your own. It'll ruin it for all of us, is what they told him. And, he's, well, okay, well, tell me your plans. And so they told him, Easter Sunday, we are planning an insurrection in Dublin. We are going to take the city of Dublin by force. And here's the plan. We have got the volunteers ready. They are going to call it a day of, what did they call it? Maneuvering and parading in Dublin, basically showing the force of the Irish volunteers. And then without knowledge to most of the volunteers, and certainly without knowledge to Owen McNeill, they plan to begin an insurrection. They plan to read, and they showed him this. This is basically their Declaration of Independence. This is the provisional government of the Irish Republic. And They have drafted this up to read at the beginning of the insurrection. And they said, we're going to start an insurrection and we expect that the volunteers will just fall in line. So I think some of us who've been through protest movement, we've seen this tactic before where you lead a group of people, unbeknownst to them, into a heavier action than maybe you advertised. Not always a good idea. In this case, we don't know whether it was a good idea or not because it did not come to pass, and I'll tell you why. But first, the Irish Republican Brotherhood Military Council, they tell James Connolly, we'd like you to sit on the military council. Before it was 6 people before James Connolly. They said they would like you to sit on the military council, and the Irish Citizens Army will march with us. And they also tell him, you will be the commander of all military operations at the General Post Office, at the GPO, which is the headquarters, making him the default commandant of all military operations for the Rising. So he's given basically the generalship to this whole operation, and a seat on the military council and in the new provisional government. So James Connolly agrees. He says, okay, well, this will be a good first step. We'll take Dublin. It'll be a fight for independence for Ireland. And then, his eventual goal was still to fight for socialism in Ireland and internationally. But he says, okay, for now, this is it. Common enemy. We're doing it. So they begin to work together, and the IRB discloses to James Connolly that they have Sir Roger Casement, working with the German government because World War II. So Germany would be very happy if there was an insurrection in Ireland that distracted England during the Great War. And so Germany wants to help. Roger Casement feels like they're not actually helping as much as possible. And this is an interesting thing that doesn't get talked about a lot. Roger Casement was actually trying to get back to Ireland to convince the leaders of the Rising not to have an insurrection on Easter Sunday because he didn't feel like there was enough support from Germany. I don't think that would have changed any of their minds. But what he did get from Germany was there was this a military ship coming from Germany with 20,000 rifles, some regular rifles, and I think something like 2,000 of them were machine guns, which, in 1916, it was a big deal to have some machine guns on your side. So 20,000, but remember they were gonna have 15,000 volunteers, plus the Irish Citizens Army, and then whoever else. They thought that that would be a popular rising once they started the insurrection. So they were preparing for a massive military operation, a big showdown. And so 20,000 rifles. So now they're thinking they're looking good. They got 15,000 Irish volunteers coming, trained, but ready to go, military force, 20,000 rifles, and plus just buttloads of ammo, just tons and tons of ammo. So this is looking pretty good until Good Friday. So the Friday prior to Easter. Good Friday, Roger Casement made it before the guns, but never made it to, he was also supposed to accept the shipment. Never made it to pick up the shipment. The German ship with the weapons on it was also intercepted. So they didn't get there, the guns. So you imagine 2 days before you're supposed to mount an insurrection with 15,000 people and you think you have 20,000 good arms and ammo coming, and you find out that no, actually you don't. So obviously a big wind out of the sails, big letdown, and it gets worse from there. Somehow Eoin MacNeill catches wind of this because of all of the trouble with the guns, is my understanding. Actually, what I hear is that, or what I read was that somehow word got to New York. And of course, there was a huge support. There were something like almost as many Irish descendants in the United States by this time as there were on the island at that time. So there was huge support and resources for the Irish Republican Brotherhood were coming from the United States. Not so much the ICA. The ICA did have, James Connolly spent some time in the United States as an IWW organizer. So they had support also, but the Republican Brotherhood had a lot. And so somehow word got to New York, and that word got back to Owen McNeil, because a lot of people who weren't in the actual organizing of the thing didn't realize that Owen McNeil was not privy to the information that it was actually going to be an armed insurrection. Well, now he becomes aware that that is the plan. So Saturday, he issues a proclamation. It's printed in newspapers. It's delivered to all of the regiments of the volunteers in all parts of Ireland. All parading and maneuvering for Easter Sunday is canceled. No one, it's a direct order, no one is to go to Dublin and participate in any sort of parades or maneuvering on Easter Sunday. So, in 2 days before this insurrection is planned, they lose all their weapons, or not all their weapons, but they lose this huge shipment of weapons, and they have no idea how many volunteers, if any, are going to show up. So the military council convenes. As you can imagine, James Connolly, who was ready to go with the Citizens Army, 250 people, was like, no, we are doing this. This is happening. The rest of the council is torn. I guess I'll tell you now who the rest of the council was, who was also going to be the leaders of the new provisional government until they got things sorted. The most notable, probably an important person to remember, is Patrick Pearse. Patrick Pearse, as they like to say, his Gaelic name, Patrick Pearse. He was going to be the new president. He signed the declaration. Thomas Clark, I think, was the most senior member of the IRB, and so he was the first to sign, meaning he'd been around for the longest, not necessarily he was the most senior in title. Thomas MacDonagh, Eamon Shent, and Sean MacDiarmid, and Joseph Plunkett. And Joseph Plunkett, I always remember him because that's who the song Grace was written about. He was sick already. He was like, I don't remember what he had. He had some sort of disease, and he was really sick when the rising started, but he went to the GPO anyway, sat on the military council, participated the whole time. And when it was over in jail, he married Grace. Just before, spoiler alert, they executed him. So there's this romantic song, Grace. Maybe I'll record it and put it up. At any rate, those are the six besides, and then of course there was James Connolly, who joined the military council and signed the declaration and was going to be part of the provisional government. So those are the seven leaders who we consider the leaders of the rising. So, no guns, maybe no army, military council convenes, debate is held. Ultimately, they decide to postpone the rising by 1 day. That's why it did not happen on Easter Sunday, but rather Easter Monday. And there's a story about when James Connolly's daughter Nora was cooking breakfast for the leaders of the rising on Easter Sunday. And then there's a story about she's old enough to know, I don't remember how old she was, but she's old enough to know what's going on, and she's heard all the stuff about the guns and the volunteers. Oh, by the way, they postponed it for a day so that they could issue countermands to Owen McNeil's direction not to, and tried to get them out, saying, no, actually do come. And we'll see whether we think that was successful or not. But volunteers did start to arrive on Easter Sunday, but not in the droves that they had hoped. So James Connolly was talking to his daughter Nora, and his daughter Nora heard about all these troubles, and she said, are you really going to fight, Dad, even though all of this happened? And he said something along the lines of, we must fight. If we don't fight now, the best we can hope for is that a great earthquake will come, open the earth, and swallow us in our shame. Basically saying, we said we're fighting, now we have to fight, or we'll never get over the shame of it. So I always thought that was kind of an amazing thing that he said. But at any rate, the fight is happening, they're going, and on Easter Sunday, they start to receive volunteers. It's estimated that by Easter Monday morning, they had 1,200 or so Irish volunteers. and about 250 from the Irish Citizens Army, and a couple of hundred, maybe other independent Fenians, just Irish folks who believed in the cause, who were not part of any organization. So they're saying, somewhere between 15 and 1,700 people. And that sounds terrible. But also, at the time, the British military had about 1,000 troops in Ireland, or in Dublin. Problem is, they had a ton of weapons and a lot of troops nearby that could have come. The other sad thing to think about is that a lot of the regiments in the British Army at that time were Irish folks who enlisted for World War I, and thought eventually they would be fighting for Irish independence. So that's just a really sad sort of thought about what actually happened, who actually died, who suffered for the Rising. However, in addressing the Irish Citizens Army before the Rising, on the morning of the Rising, or maybe the night before, James Connolly said, "The odds against us now are 1,000 to 1. We are almost certainly marching out to defeat. However, should we prevail, hold on to your rifles. The volunteers have very different ideas about what happens next. Hold on to your rifles." And this, to me, was an amazing foreshadowing of what would happen eventually at the end of the Irish Civil War, when the treaty was signed, where a lot of people, including pretty much all of the ICA, were not in favor of the treaty and would end up fighting against their former comrades in arms, and Michael Collins. They would fight against them because they said, no, 26 counties is not enough. We need all 32 counties united and free. And so eventually, many years later, they did hold on to their rifles as commanded on the morning of the Easter Rising. So that's the setup. Irish nationalists, Irish volunteers, Irish Republican Brotherhood, Irish Citizens Army, all come together. Series of unfortunate events, decide to go for it anyway. The morning of Easter Monday, they march out holding the proclamation. And I'll tell the story of the actual day of the Easter Rising, hopefully tomorrow. We'll see. Oh, by the way, I brought these out. These are the Easter lilies. They're the symbol of the Rising. So, nice little decor. I hope that this has been interesting to a couple people.